In this tutorial series, you will learn how to integrate any 3D objects seamlessly into backplates. For part 1, we will learn how to prepare the backplate in our 3D scene, then build a matching lighting and GI setup, and finally discover how to apply tone mapping without affecting the backplate. In this video, I will show you my personal workflow to integrate a 3D object into a backplate. That means into a picture that was shot with an actual camera. And we're going to focus on how we can match the lighting, how we can match the reflections, refractions, and everything that it takes in order to integrate this 3D object, in this case this car, believably into this environment in here. Let's first gather some required resources, and for this I'm here on one of my favorite websites, polyhaven.com, where you can find a lot of free HDRIs. What many people don't know is that many of those HDRIs also come together with backplates. So if I enter here the tag backplates, then I will see only HDRIs that have backplates included. Now let's just find some HDRI that we want to use in our scene. Then we'll just use this one in here. And now if I click on this button, you can see that there's a lot of backplates here also included with this HDRI. So the HDRI itself is a spherical map. That means it has the whole 360-degree environment baked into this one map. The backplates themselves are just shot with a normal camera, with a normal lens in different directions at the same location where this HDRI here was taken. So as a 3D lighting and shading artist, one very common task would be to integrate an object, for example a product, a car or whatever, into a backplate that is provided to you by the client. Those backplates could also be animated, for example, if you work on movies, but here in this tutorial let's now focus just on still frames. So we will download this HDRI because that will help us to integrate our object into the backplate. And then of course also the backplate itself, and let's just choose this one here. Once you try to download this, you will see that there's different kind of options. We have the original RAW that comes straight from the camera, then the plain JPEG, that's just a one-to-one conversion of the RAW. Let's check out how this one here looks like. You can see we have like kind of blown out highlights. You can't really see a lot of detail in the sky. Saturation looks a little bit dull and so on. That's why we also have this pretty JPEG. So once you open this, you can see that this pretty JPEG basically has some tone mapping already applied to it. The highlights are toned down, the contrast is increased, and so on. So we're just going to use this picture in here in order to integrate our object. So once you download the HDRI and the backplate itself, let's jump to 3ds Max and see what we can do in order to integrate our model. So in 3ds Max, I created a new physical camera. It doesn't really matter what kind of settings you put in here at first, because all of this will be handled later automatically. And then we just need to go to our render setup and just choose a render resolution that has the same kind of dimensions like our backplate. In my case, it would be 1280 x 1920. You can then verify this by pressing Shift F, and then you can see the dimensions of your render view in your viewport. Now we can press Alt B in order to load a file here into our background. Let's just load this file that we downloaded before, this backplate, and apply this to our active view in here. So now with the camera still selected, we move to this Utilities tab and then choose this Perspective Match option. Once we do this, we show our vanishing lines. Then we can see we have these lines here appearing on our backplate, and those we kind of have to match to the perspective lines of our backplate. In this example here, in order to speed up the tutorial, I prepared this already, so you can see I matched those perspective lines here with the red lines in this axis and then with the green lines in the other axis. And then once you do this, your camera will be adjusted and will produce you a picture that matches your backplate. You can kind of verify this by adding, for example, a plane in here. And then once you move that back and forth, you can see this one follows here our floor. We move it up or down, you can see that here those perspective lines kind of like work together the same way like those flow lines in here. Like this way you can verify that your perspective matches this backplate in here. So now that we have our camera set up, instead of working on a very complicated model with already shaders and so on, let's work on a much more simplified model. And for this, we just use this basic shading dummy in here and just apply a gray material without any kind of reflection here. And then let's see what will happen if we start a rendering. So as you can see, we have a completely black rendering, and that's of course expected because we didn't really create any of our lighting and environment yet. And we only have here something that shows up into the alpha channel of our picture. We also don't really have the backplate showing up here in the render view. That's because we just added this backplate here into our viewport background. In order to have the backplate show up in our render view, there's two different options. One would be to just go inside here and just add a new background element. Once we do this, we just load the backplate we downloaded before. Now you can see we have it show up here in our background. For me personally, I don't really like to use this workflow because it has a bunch of disadvantages. For example, if I use this real zoom feature and I zoom into my rendering, you can see that the background just stays at exactly the same position and only my 3D geometry seems to zoom. That is one disadvantage. Another disadvantage is that it always sits on top of the lens effect. So if I have a very bright lens flare, the lens flare will be kind of cut off here on the edges. And also overall, any kind of blending with like half transparent objects doesn't really work at all. And it creates some really ugly results. So that's why I normally don't like to use this background option here. And instead, I much more prefer to load my backplate into this environment slot. Let's use a V-Ray bitmap in here. Then once we do this, load the backplate, you can see now the result looks kind of weird. We have to fix that. Let's go to material editor and then instance this backplate into here. Let's call it, for example, backplate. And now the mapping type is set to 3ds Max standard. And down here in this coordinates tab, we can choose a different kind of mapping type for 3ds Max. And we use environment and then this mapping type screen, and then the background will be loaded correctly here into the screen space of our camera. You see now another weird result is that here the shading dummy kind of looks like it becomes transparent. And that's actually not the case because here the environment map is also being used for GI, for example. That's why if we go here to this GI tab, we can see since it's used for screen space, it's projected like this way here into our GI channel. And that's why it looks like this whole thing here becomes transparent. So in order to fix this, we just need to go to our render settings. And then here in this environment tab, just override the GI environment with black. And also we can do the same thing here for reflection and refraction, so that we just make sure that this environment map is not being used for anything else except to show up here in our background. So in this very first step, we're gonna focus on replicating the lighting and the GI to match this one to the backplate. For this, it's always good to find some kind of reference points in your scene, like this pole here, for example, where we can see directly where the sun is located in the scene, and then how soft the shadow is, what kind of saturation the shadow has, what kind of color our bounce light has, and so on. So always examine your backplate and see if you can find some reference points in there. So before we add some lights, we also need to have a floor so that we have some shadows on the floor. And for this, I just have this very simple cylindrical geometry here under our object. And now we just need to define it as a matte object. That means we only receive the shadows. We don't really see the actual object. And that's done in here. So we just define this as a matte object, make the alpha contribution to -1. And then we need to catch the shadows from the direct lights and also make sure to affect the alpha in here. So once we set up those settings in here, we can close this. And then this here disappears again. But as soon as we add some light, we can see that now we have some shadow that's here placed on the ground. So let me just add a V-Ray sun here into the scene. And it asks if we want to put a V-Ray sky into the environment map. We don't want that because we have our backplate already present in there. So we say no. And then once we have this and we move up the sun a little bit, you can see we have now some lighting in our scene and then also a shadow that's placed here on the ground. So for matching the lighting for exterior scenes at least, I normally don't tend to use the HDRI itself, but I tend to use just a V-Ray sun and a dome light, because like this way you are much more flexible. You can define exactly the position where the light comes from. You can define the shadow softness. You can define the color of the bounce light and so on. So that's why normally I don't use the HDRI for lighting my scene. I only use that in a later step for reflections and refraction. So here we have our reference object, and let me unhide other object that I placed in here earlier. You can see I tried to replicate the shape of this object. Now we just need to match our shadow to this one in here. So for this we can just move our sun around, and let's just find the correct position and then see at what point, you can see the shadow here is moving, at what point the direction here of the shadow kind of matches. So I think like this, maybe the direction matches, and now I can just go lower, maybe move it a little bit in this direction. So I think like this we have now something that looks in terms of shape and length here very similar to the one here in this reference object. So now let's first adjust certain things here about the sun in our scene. Let's go to the properties, and we can choose a different color because at the moment it is just this standard V-Ray sun system. And that means we have some kind of color tones that are mixed into the light depending on the altitude here of the sun. We don't want that for matching, so let's just go here to override. And then here our light becomes completely white. And now we can define, for example, a different kind of color in here. We can pick this color, for example, here on this part, and then just increase the value to have just slightly warmish color in here. With the size multiplier, we can then define the softness of the shadow. If we go to very high values, you can see that we have some very soft shadows in here. In this case, let's just choose a value of 6, for example. So we still have kind of sharp shadows, but they are not as sharp as they just been a moment ago, like these razor sharp shadows. But now they're a little bit soft, at least once it trails off here from the object itself. So now you might see that the shadows here are completely black. The reason for that is that we don't have any fill light in our scene at the moment. This we're gonna change now. So let's just add a new V-Ray light here into the scene, and then change the mode here from plane to dome light. And then once we do this, we need to put the multiplier here at 1 and also make the light itself invisible. So it still doesn't seem to brighten up the shadow here by a lot. The reason for that is that our sunlight is way too strong. So let me just reduce the intensity here of the sunlight to, for example, 0.1. Now we can see that this kind of dome light here, if I switch it on and off, you can see it brightens up here our shadow. We can see we have now kind of a similar intensity than this shadow in here. Just the saturation itself doesn't seem to match. For this we can just choose a different kind of mode in here. Let's choose a temperature mode, and then once we enter here a different kind of Kelvin number, you can see the more blue I get, also the more blue our shadow gets. Also the object itself, of course, because it gets all of this kind of bounce light. But in this case, for example, let's choose a value of 9000. I think then we have kind of a nice balance between a kind of bluish shadow and then a warmish light that comes from here. So now I think this shadow here kind of matches, the direction matches, the softness matches, and also the intensity and the color tones kind of match. So now I think we can just zoom back here and see how our whole object here looks like. So now we matched here the shadow for these background objects. Like this way it also matches here for our foreground object, so light direction matches and the shadow as well. And if we want, we can just dial back, for example, here on the softness of the shadow. If we think it's too soft, we can make it sharp again or find some kind of in between, and then the shadow doesn't get completely soft. And that's the advantage that we use this kind of procedural V-Ray sun. We can dial in all of those settings, saturation of the filter color and so on later on the spot, and we're not really bound to a baked in HDRI where we just have to take all of the settings over from the HDRI itself. Now let's verify the specular intensity of our sun. For this, let's just open the material editor, and this is the material that I use at the moment for this shading dummy. It's just this gray material without any reflection, but some kind of glossiness in here. And let's first disable here in the options the trace reflections, because we didn't really set up any kind of environment yet, and we only want to check like the intensity of our specular from the sun. So once this is switched off, we can just put back the reflection to pure white. Now we can see that the specular intensity is kind of very strong. We can go to our light and then adjust this by just using this effect specular button in here. And for example, just choose a value of 0.1. And then I think the specular is toned down a little bit and it kind of looks more fitting here to the scene. Let me just give you some few remaining hints about this kind of ground plane in here. So this one is a matte object, and that's why we can see these kind of shadows here on top of our backplate, but it's also responsible for the bounce light from the floor onto our object itself. So let me just pick this shader in here. As you can see, it's very simple. It just uses a diffuse color that's very similar to the color here of this floor. But once you change the diffuse color here to something else, you can see it heavily impacts the appearance of your object on top of your backplate. So it's just always good to find some kind of color tone that matches the color tone here of your backplate. Or even better, you just project something from the backplate here onto this matte object ground floor. So now we have one remaining big problem, and that is that we render currently a linear image on top of our already tone mapped backplate. So you can remember, once we downloaded the backplate, we chose the so-called pretty JPEG, which already had like the highlight intensity reduced, the contrast increased, the saturation adjusted, and so on. So now here our foreground, our 3D object, is a pure linear image that is not tone mapped yet, and the background is already tone mapped, and we're kind of mixing two different worlds together, which at the moment don't really seem to fit. So what you need to do is to apply some tone mapping here for your linear image. So I prepared here already the 3 different tone mapping adjustments that I want to apply on my linear part of the image. But as you can see, once I enable them, it gets applied on the whole image here. Also, what I don't want on the backplate, because this one is already tone mapped, it shouldn't get some additional tone mapping applied to it. So we need to find some way to only apply these kind of adjustments here on the linear part of the image, which is all the 3D geometry that I'm adding to this backplate. So we need to render a mask for all of the parts of this image that contains linear data. And this is this matte all mask that I built in here. Let me show you how I did this. I just went to the render settings, and then in the render elements, I just added a new multi-matte element and then just renamed it to matte all. And then inside here, you can choose different kind of object IDs that are getting masked. And I just chose for all 3 channels the object ID of 0. That means that every object that is added to my scene, which by default always has an ID of 0, is automatically masked and will always generate this kind of updated mask no matter which kind of object I add into the scene. Now I just need to apply this mask to my tone mapping adjustments. And for this, I just right click here, say new layer, and then choose a multi-matte mask. Once I do this, we can see it's now choosing the red channel of here our matte all render element. And like this way, it only is applied here on the linear data. So I need to do this for all of those 3 different parts in here. So let's add here another multi-matte mask, and then here also another multi-matte mask. And now you can see that here all of those adjustments are only added to the linear part here of this image, and the backplate itself is not affected. So now that we have our tone mapping in place, it's time to do some final adjustments for the direct light and the GI. And I feel here for the sun it is still a little bit too strong, so let's dial back the intensity to, for example, 0.05. And then also for the skylight, let's choose a different temperature value because I feel it's a bit too bluish now. And let's choose a value of 8000. Like this, I guess it fits a bit better into this environment. Now we can also disable the effect specular and reflections for the dome light because we don't really need this for this part. Because in the next part, in part 2 of this tutorial series, we'll build the whole environment, the whole reflective and refractive environment. Because at the moment, if we add now our metallic shader, so this one here is a shader that has a metalness of 1. We can see it has 0 diffuse contribution, and at the moment our whole environment is completely black. So we need to fix that in the next part, and then once we have the reflections and refractions set up, then we can build any kind of shader and it will always look and behave correctly with this kind of backplate. So if you watch this tutorial until here, chances are that you're also interested about the content that I provide on my Patreon, where I have, for example, a whole car rendering course about how to set up the shaders for this car in here and how to render that in a realistic environment. So you can check out this, also some additional bonus videos for my tutorials, and also download all of my scene files over there. Also be sure to subscribe to this channel to be notified when the second part of this video here is released. And if you want to watch that instantly, you can also find that right away now already on my Patreon. So I hope that was helpful for you so far. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. I normally tend to answer all of my comments in there. And other than that, see you in the next part and in my other tutorials.